The Zorati were once the architects of wonders beyond imagination. Their cities floated in the skies of crimson worlds, and their fleets sailed the currents of stars. Knowledge, power, and culture wove them into a species that believed they had conquered all obstacles the universe could offer. But empires, no matter how vast or mighty, crumble not from external sieges but from internal decay. The Zorati's pride, once their armor, became their poison. Factions rose, each convinced they held the purest vision of destiny. Wars erupted among them, not for survival, but for ideology, splintering what had been the envy of the galaxy. In the aftermath, their worlds lay scorched, their wonders reduced to rubble, their numbers, once uncountable, dwindled to scattered remnants. And still, the galaxy offered no reprieve. Opportunistic predators, raiders, machines, and cosmic phenomena feasted on the remains of their once unbreakable civilization. In desperation, the Zorati cast a message into the void, a beacon carried on ancient technology, encoded with pleas in 1,000 languages. It was a cry not of a proud race, but of a people broken beyond repair. A final act of hope, hurled into an indifferent abyss. The galaxy, vast and teeming with life, answered with silence. Those who heard the call judged the Zorati as fallen, unworthy of assistance. Others feared the same fate would befall them if they intervened. There were even those who believed helping would invite doom upon their own houses. So the Zorati withered, isolated, clutching to what little dignity they had left as their worlds grew colder, darker, quieter. On a blue world orbiting a modest star in a forgotten arm of the galaxy, the signal was caught by accident. A human-operated deep space array, originally intended for scanning anomalies, stumbled upon the dying call. To human engineers, it was more curiosity than discovery at first, a technical challenge to decode an ancient, decaying transmission. But as the fragments of desperate appeals took shape, humanity realized it had been addressed not to gods or angels, but to anyone who would listen. Against the vast cold of space, the Zorati had whispered into the dark, and humanity had heard. On Earth, debates ignited. Scientists argued for study, for learning. Militaries raised alarms. Politicians saw opportunity and risk. Ordinary people, whose voices rarely touched grand decisions, demanded action driven by empathy. Throughout human history, the call of the vulnerable had rarely been ignored for long. It was not in their nature to turn away from the wounded, the desperate, the broken. Across oceans, deserts, and skies, humanity had always answered cries for help, even when doing so came at a terrible cost. They were flawed, impulsive, and often divided, but when faced with a choice to be compassionate or indifferent, humanity had a habit of choosing compassion. The final decision was made not with perfect consensus, but with determined will. Earth's nations, disparate and fractured in their own ways, rallied behind a single cause: to send aid. Ships were retrofitted. Supplies gathered. Scientists and soldiers alike volunteered, not for conquest, not for profit, but because a dying people had asked for help and humanity believed that they could not call themselves civilized if they ignored it. The announcement echoed across Earth's networks: humanity will answer. The preparations were furious and chaotic. An expeditionary fleet was assembled with a speed that defied logistical odds. Vessels designed for exploration, refitted for endurance and defense, were filled with everything a dying civilization might need. Medicine, food, engineering drones, atmospheric processors, libraries of knowledge, and thousands of volunteers willing to travel into the unknown with no guarantee of return. Among the volunteers were doctors hardened by wars fought on shattered cities, engineers who had rebuilt communities after disasters both natural and man-made, diplomats trained in conflict resolution, and soldiers who understood that sometimes, to save lives, one must be prepared to defend them with strength. Humanity was not naive. They did not march into the void assuming gratitude or peace awaited them. They knew only that a choice had been made, and that they would see it through. As the fleet prepared to depart, there was a solemnity that hung over Earth. This was no grand campaign of expansion. It was a gamble with no promise of gain, no assurance of survival. It was a statement, carved into the fabric of history, that humanity would not let a plea for help go unanswered. On the day of departure, the ships lifted from Earth's gravity wells with the roaring fury of engines built not for war, but for hope. Families watched from every continent as points of light arced into the sky, vanishing into the heavens, carrying with them the prayers and ambitions of an entire species. Days turned into weeks as the fleet navigated the vast, empty gulfs between stars. Time lost its meaning. Space, cold and endless, pressed against their minds. Some among them wondered if they would find nothing at the other end, if the Zorati were already extinct, if the signal had simply outlived its creators. But the fleet pressed on, driven not by certainty, but by duty. Finally, after a journey that stretched the limits of human endurance and technology, the shattered remains of Zorth Prime came into view. The once glorious world floated like a ghost amid the wreckage of its own dreams. Orbiting structures, once monuments to technological achievement, were reduced to drifting debris fields. The planet's surface was scarred, pockmarked with the ruins of cities that had once kissed the clouds. The first human ships cautiously entered orbit, sensors scanning for signs of life, for hidden threat. Initial readings were grim. The planet's biosphere was collapsing. Radiation storms swept across continents. Oceans had receded or boiled away. And yet, amid the devastation, there were faint signals, unmistakably artificial, calling out weakly. Landing teams deployed. They touched down not onto gleaming landing pads or ceremonial grounds, but onto cracked, poisoned soil. Humanity's first steps on Zorth Prime were into the heart of decay. The survivors who emerged to meet them were barely recognizable compared to the noble figures from the Zorati's own transmitted histories. They were gaunt, their once vibrant forms dulled by disease and starvation. Eyes that once shone with pride now burned with suspicion and despair. They regarded the humans with wariness, uncertain if these newcomers were saviors, scavengers, or conquerors. Humanity approached not with weapons drawn, but with hands open. They offered water first, pure, clean, untainted. The Zorati accepted it with trembling hands. They offered medicine next, and those who could barely stand were eased to the ground and treated. Slowly, hesitantly, the Zorati realized the humans had not come to plunder or to dominate. They had come because they had chosen to help. Among the first acts carried out by the human expedition was the establishment of triage centers. Human doctors, accustomed to working in the chaos of conflict zones, moved with efficiency and compassion. They treated infections that Zorati medics had given up on. They stabilized failing organs, repaired broken bones, eased the suffering of the young and old alike. Engineers patched power systems, restored failing oxygen recyclers, and repaired water purifiers, salvaging what little infrastructure remained. The reinforcements arrived sooner than expected. Humanity had accelerated production beyond projections, driven by a unified determination rarely seen even in their own wars. The second wave of ships brought heavier equipment. Modular fortifications, drone swarms for perimeter defense, mobile factories capable of printing parts and tools out of local resources, and advanced medical facilities that could handle entire populations. The Zorati watched with quiet astonishment as the humans did not merely patch the broken remnants of their world. They began to rebuild. They worked without complaint through toxic storms and hostile terrain. They brought light back to places that had only known darkness for decades. They shared everything, food, medicine, technology, without demand for tribute or submission. It confused the Zorati, who had lived so long under the expectation that aid always came with chains. Communication remained a struggle at first. The Zorati language had evolved in ways that translation AIs struggled to process. Human linguists worked side by side with Zorati scholars, trading concepts and symbols until mutual understanding emerged. It was not a process of imposition, but collaboration. Humanity had no desire to overwrite Zorati culture. They sought only to understand it, to respect it. Slowly, bonds formed. Children, unburdened by the weight of past traumas, were the first to bridge the gap. They learned each other's games, laughed at strange jokes, and created pidgin languages blending the best of both worlds. Where adults hesitated, children rushed forward, and in doing so, they dragged their elders towards something resembling trust. It became clear to human leadership that aid alone would not be enough. The Zorati, though willing, were broken in spirit. Centuries of war, betrayal, and suffering had instilled in them a reflexive fatalism. Rebuilding infrastructure was simple compared to rebuilding will. Humanity needed to show the Zorati not just survival, but purpose. They began with small victories. Restored hospitals reopened their doors. Power grids buzzed with energy for the first time in decades. Clean water flowed in settlements thought abandoned. Farming programs seeded reclaimed land with hardy crops engineered to survive the toxic environment. Everywhere the humans touched, the world grew just a little less dead. The Zorati responded in ways unexpected even to themselves. Pride, buried deep beneath layers of despair, began to stir. They volunteered to learn human methods of engineering, medicine, governance. They adapted human tools to their own designs, blending old knowledge with new possibility. Together, human and Zorati crews expanded safe zones across the surface, each new beacon of life a testament that extinction was not inevitable. But threats loomed. The old enemy had noticed the flicker of renewed activity on Zorath Prime. Probes of alien origin began appearing at the edge of the system. Small, stealthy, and malevolent, they mapped human positions and tested defenses. Humanity knew the full force of the predators was not far behind. They responded with characteristic bluntness. Orbital defense platforms were constructed. Fighters patrolled the skies. Surface-to-space missile batteries were hidden across the planet. The humans did not expect to hold forever, but they intended to make the cost of assault prohibitive. In the weeks that followed, the first skirmishes erupted. Enemy scouts attempted to land and were annihilated with precise ferocity. Human marines, trained in brutal urban warfare, adapted easily to the crumbled ruins of Zorati cities. They fought not to conquer, but to buy time, time for the rebuilding, for hope to root itself so deeply that it could not be ripped out. The Zorati, once paralyzed by fear, began to join the battles. They were not asked. They volunteered. They picked up weapons once discarded in shame and stood beside human soldiers in the ruins of their ancestors' dreams. They learned quickly. They remembered what it meant to fight for something other than survival, to fight for a future. A remarkable thing happened during the darkest night. Around campfires built from scavenged debris, humans and Zorati shared stories. They spoke of losses, of victories, of foolish hopes and stubborn dreams. They found common ground not in strength, but in the ache of enduring pain and refusing to let it define them. Trust hardened into something stronger, loyalty. When the enemy came in force, they found not a dying world but a living one. They expected scattered survivors, isolated and easily crushed. They found an army, not just of soldiers but of people determined to protect one another. The first major battle erupted in low orbit. Human gunships dueled sleek alien warcraft. Barrages of missiles painted the void with burning trails. The enemy struck hard and fast, but humanity struck harder. On the surface, integrated human Zorati units fought a desperate holding action against enemy dropship. For every inch of ground taken, the enemy paid in blood. Makeshift barricades turned narrow streets into kill zones. Snipers perched atop ruins brought down enemy officers. Mobile artillery units, cobbled together from human and Zorati designs, laid down relentless fire. It was not technology that turned the tide, though human technology was formidable. It was resolve. Where the enemy expected fear, they found rage. Where they anticipated retreat, they met stubborn defense. Humanity had taught the Zorati a simple, terrible lesson, that giving up was a choice and that defiance was its own kind of power. The battle raged for days. Losses mounted. Parts of the rebuilt settlements were reduced once more to rubble. But when the smoke cleared, the enemy withdrew. Not in triumph, but in defeat. They had underestimated not the weapons of humanity, but its will. Victory came at a cost. Human and Zorati casualties were high. Graves were dug, not just for the fallen, but for the weight of what had been sacrificed. Mourning was shared equally across species lines. In grief, as in battle, they had become one people. The fleet leadership faced a grim truth. More attacks would come. The enemy had tasted human defiance and would not tolerate it. Earth was informed of the situation in brutally honest terms. There was no plea for rescue. There was only a statement of intent. We hold. We endure. We fight. Humanity, hearing this, did not hesitate. New fleets were mobilized. Recruitment offices overflowed with volunteers. Donations of materials, money, and labor poured in. Across Earth, the story of Zorth Prime had captured hearts and minds. It was no longer a mission of mercy. It was a declaration. Humanity does not abandon those it has pledged to save. On Zorth Prime, preparations continued. Schools reopened, teaching a hybrid curriculum of Zorati tradition and human innovation. Libraries were rebuilt, filled with knowledge once thought lost. New cities began to rise, forged from the ruins, designed with the strengths of two civilizations. Children played in streets under artificial skies. Markets bustled with goods both alien and familiar. Music, once a rarity, filled the air. Against all odds, life had not only returned, it had flourished. The humans integrated deeper into Zorati society. Marriages crossed species lines. Joint councils governed new settlements. Traditions blended and evolved. There was no erasure, only growth. Humanity did not seek to overwrite what was left of Zorati culture. Back on Earth, news of the battle spread like wildfire. Footage of Zorati civilians carrying wounded human marines to safety, of human soldiers refusing evacuation to cover Zorati children fleeing to shelters, ignited a response humanity had not anticipated. Volunteers signed up in such numbers that entire fleets of transports were commissioned solely to ferry them across the void. Supplies were requisitioned at unprecedented levels. Economies bent, societies shifted, as humanity funneled everything it had into the defense of a people it had once never known. The second wave of human reinforcements arrived in the middle of the greatest siege Zorth Prime had ever faced. Fresh divisions of soldiers, squadrons of ships, and convoys of supplies punched through enemy lines with coordinated brilliance. Orbital superiority battles raged for days, each side feeding more and more assets into the meat grinder of space. Human and Zorati engineers had not been idle during the months of rebuilding. Hidden in the mountains, massive construction yards had birthed something new. Hybrid warships, blending the adaptability of human designs with the energy manipulation technologies salvaged from Zorati archives. When these ships entered battle, they shifted the tide. Shields regenerated faster than enemy weapons could deplete them. Artillery strikes were calculated with such precision that entire enemy cruisers were sheared apart before they could even fire. But no advantage lasted long. The enemy adapted. They deployed weapons unseen before. Blackshard missiles that disrupted gravity fields, synthetic viruses targeting human AI systems, nightmare shock troops biologically engineered to resist pain and fear. The defenders answered with innovation born of desperation. Human Zorati biotech labs unleashed countermeasures faster than the enemy could escalate. Shield harmonics were recalibrated mid-battle. AI security protocols mutated faster than the viruses could replicate. Every battlefield became a testing ground where survival demanded relentless evolution. The heart of the resistance was not the ships or the weapons. It was the people. Acts of individual heroism multiplied beyond counting. Zorati elders, once resigned to die in silence, led evacuation efforts through burning ruins. Human medics operated for 70 hours straight, refusing rest until the last wounded soul was pulled from collapsed shelters. Engineers repaired plasma conduits under direct fire, knowing a single failure would doom entire defensive sectors. Leaders emerged, not from appointed ranks but from those who refused to break. A human sergeant, refusing orders to retreat, rallied a collapsed line and personally led a countercharge that saved a critical sector. A Zorati scholar-turned-strategist coordinated guerrilla strikes that devastated enemy supply lines behind the front. Victory was never certain. Every day of survival was paid for with blood. Yet against the grinding horror of annihilation, a new truth crystallized. The enemy could not comprehend the defenders' unity. They could not fathom a bond born not of domination or fear, but of choice. Humanity and the Zorati had chosen to fight for each other, and that choice made them unbreakable in ways no empire could predict. In the final stages of the battle, the enemy deployed their ultimate weapon, a world-killer ship, a construct of pure terror designed to strip a planet's surface down to ash and ruin. It loomed over Zorath Prime, charging for the final strike. Humanity answered with everything it had. A combined fleet of Earth's finest warships and Zorati skyfighters executed a suicide assault against impossible odds. Ships peeled apart under enemy fire, but not before launching wave after wave of coordinated torpedoes and kinetic strike. Drones swarmed through breaches, sabotaging internal systems. Boarding parties fought deck by deck, sacrificing themselves to cripple key systems. In orbit, the battle reached a fever pitch. The World Killer's charging beam faltered. Gouts of fire erupted along its spine. Human Zorati strike teams reached the core and, knowing they would never leave, overloaded the primary reactors. The resulting explosion painted the void with a dying star's fury. Below, the defenders watched the sky light up, saw death turned back by sacrifice, and knew that no matter what happened next, they had broken the enemy's will. In the days that followed, the shattered remnants of the enemy fleet limped away, unwilling or unable to continue the assault. Zorath Prime, devastated but unconquered, stood free. Rebuilding began anew, not just with human aid, but with Zorati determination that no longer needed outside encouragement. They had fought for themselves. They had won. Human advisors remained to assist, but the Zorati took the lead, shaping their destiny with pride untainted by dependence. New cities rose, designed with the scars of the old world in mind. Memorials were erected not merely for the dead, but for the ideals they had defended. Hybrid academies taught both human and Zorati history, not as separate paths but as a shared journey. Diplomatic envoys traveled between Earth and Zorath Prime regularly, forging a political and cultural alliance stronger than any treaty signed by fear. Children born under the new era grew up with stories not of despair but of resilience, of choosing to stand when surrender seemed easier. They spoke multiple languages, sang songs that blended human rhythm with Zorati melody, and dreamed dreams that reached across the stars. Humanity did not claim Zorath Prime as a colony, nor demand tribute. Instead, they recognized the Zorati as equals, as brothers and sisters forged in fire. Trade agreements blossomed. Technological exchanges exploded into a renaissance of innovation. Joint exploration missions set out across the galaxy, seeking to discover and defend against future threats, side by side. The memory of what had almost been lost never faded. Veterans of the war, both human and Zorati, became the keepers of that memory, ensuring new generations understood the price of survival, the cost of unity. Across Earth, statues were raised. A human soldier offering a Zorati child a hand, not as a conqueror but as a friend. Across Zorath Prime, murals were painted. Human and Zorati defenders standing together against an oncoming darkness, heads unbowed. In the vastness of the galaxy, where cold empires rose and fell without meaning, a new force had emerged, not an empire of domination, but a federation of will. One built not on conquest but on choice. one that understood the hardest victories were not won by the sharpest blade or the strongest arm, but by the willingness to stand for one another when all hope seemed lost. The enemy, shattered and scattered, would never forget what humanity had taught them. That the most dangerous foe was not one who sought to destroy, but one who refused to be broken. In the end, the desperate call for help had been answered. Not with words, not with empty promises, but with action, with sacrifice, with an unyielding refusal to let another light in the universe go out. Humanity had risen to the challenge, and in doing so, they had become something more than they had ever been before. They had become the defenders of hope itself, and hope, once kindled by the desperate, had become unstoppable,